In this video, we're going to look at the early education that Plato prescribes in his ideal city. The most important thing to get clear on is that the goal of education is to produce virtue in the citizens. In that sense, education is less about learning particular things as it is about becoming a certain kind of person. So how can it be that you can train or educate people to become good? How is it that you even achieve this? Well, as we'll see, what Plato does is he gets some aspects of what we would call cultural education from his society, but he also develops the curriculum, adding a number of aspects and revising things that were common in his own society in order to produce better results. Right from the get-go, there are two things that are particularly striking and countercultural about Plato's education system. The first is that it explicitly involves women. Women were not typically educated in ancient Greece, and they're going to play an important role in Plato's ideal city. He wants women to be educated alongside men and have the same education that they do. The other aspect which is striking is that Plato really does want every citizen to go through the education process. Now, not everybody's going to make it all the way, but it's clear that everybody's involved. And in that sense, Plato really is one of the first advocates of a truly public education system. Education is something that everybody should have access to. Now, the structure of Plato's education system is as follows. There are two main parts, what gets called gymnastic education and what gets called musical education. It's also clear that all of the citizens are doing mathematics from an early age, but the way in which Plato wants the citizens to learn mathematics is primarily through games. So think about it this way. It doesn't need to be the kind of boring math games that your parents might have got you to play when you were younger. The thought is just to include mathematics and mathematical exercises and other kinds of fun games. So a really easy example for this in a contemporary setting is something like Dungeons and Dragons. I'm just objectively uncool, and I have accepted this as part of my being, so you can deal with it now. The point is that mathematics is going to be involved in the children's games. They're going to be adding and subtracting and doing geometrical exercises, kind of as part of their second nature. They're not conscious that they're doing mathematics exercises, but they're still learning basic mathematical principles as part of their play. Now, mathematics is going to be really important when we get to the later education in Book 7, but for now we're going to be focusing on music and gymnastics. The primary goal of gymnastic education is about teaching people to become resistant and endure through pain. The goal of musical education is to make people have well-cultivated pleasures so that they take pleasure in good and beautiful things. In that sense, the focus of the musical and gymnastic education together is to make sure that people are well disposed with respect to their pleasures and pains. Yeah, right. Let me introduce you to my friends Justin and Sebastian. What's up, my dudes? Super pumped to meet you guys. I'm real excited. It's gonna be great. We're gonna have the best time. Hello. Really is most delightful to meet you all. So like, you might be familiar with gymnastics as an Olympic sport, and like Olympics is definitely based in ancient Greece, but like gymnastics in Plato's education is just like, it's so much more than just gymnastics. Like, you could go running, and you do wrestling, and we're gonna put you on like a super clutch diet. So like, you're gonna be real strict with what you eat, we're gonna have chicken, we're gonna have rice, your diet's gonna be top notch, and you're gonna exercise every day. But also, like, it's not just about getting yourself in peak physical condition. We also have a job to do, you know? Like, we've got to protect the city, we've got to protect it from external enemies, we've got to make sure that everybody, like, in the city is chill and cool with each other. And so we're going to need military training. We're going to be working with shields, we're going to be working with spears and with swords, and we're going to get real good at fighting. We're going to be like the Spartans, but like even better than the Spartans. And even though it is true that you will get low-key ripped, it's not about that, man. Like, it's not about getting low-key ripped and strong, even though, like, you will be low-key ripped and strong. It's about the person that it makes you, right? So, like, you want to be a person with self-discipline. You want to be the person who's there first in the morning. You want to be the person who's there last at the end of the day. So you're going to be the kind of person who's just dedicated to what you do. And, like, it's going to be real tempting. Like, you're going to want a beer, you're going to want a cheesecake, and you're going to want pizza, but you just got to say no. You just got to say no, man. And if you can do that, then you're at the top of the game. You'll be able to run faster than everyone. You'll be able to lift more than everyone. And you'll have more self-discipline. You'll be a better person. You'll be stronger than everyone else. And that is the goal. That is the goal, man. So, like, I don't know if it was a philosopher, but, like, it was someone real smart. And they said, you know what they said? They said, no pain, no gain. And that's true because, like, if we're in military training and you're getting stabbed, and we're in boxing and you're getting hit, you just have to work through that pain. Pain isn't a reason to stop. The pain is a reason to push harder. And that's what we're going to do. That's what we're going to make you. We're going to make you those kinds of people. You're just going to push through. As your music tutor, we're going to cover much more than just music, as you might expect. For the Greeks, music involved not only what we would call music, namely the appropriate combination of sounds in harmonious patterns, but also poetry, dance, and various kinds of cultural pursuits that focus on cultivating the soul. Now, obviously, gymnastics is all well and good in its place, but all of that competition doesn't make for good citizens who work well with each other. Think about how an orchestra functions, or a dance troupe. The goal is not to outdo the other person. The goal is not to play the loudest or the fastest. The goal is to play well together, where you appreciate proportion, you appreciate your place, and you work not to get as fast as possible, but to get at the appropriate speed. Consider the following passage from Debussy's piece, The Prélude à l'après-midi d'une faune. The piece would be entirely ruined if you hurried that open phrase, or if the harp, the clarinet, and the horn came in too early. The point is to listen to other people, to work together with them, and then appreciate the proportions together, and then the overall result is something beautiful. If you're always competing and rushing and hurrying, you're not going to appreciate these kinds of subtle pleasures. Think also of people who recite Shakespeare. The idea, again, is not to say it as loudly as possible, or as quickly as possible, or as forcefully as possible. The point is to get across the poetry as it ought to be. So, with me as your tutor, what you'll learn through your dance, through your music, and through your poetry is how to appreciate beauty and proportion. You're going to be the kind of person who will work well with others, and will be the kind of person who's able to take pleasure in the higher things, the more abstract relations between objects, and you'll enjoy them. You won't want to rush through the pieces, and you won't want to outdo your fellow members in your orchestra and your dance troupe. You'll work together and create something truly beautiful. Now, obviously, Plato's point is you don't really want to be like Justin or like Sebastian. You want to have both aspects of these educations so that you have a well-balanced, well-rounded character. Interestingly, the way that Plato describes this balance is he talks about the slackening and the hardening of thumos. The thought's supposed to be that what gymnastic education does is it makes the spirited part of the soul tough and resilient. Whereas what musical education does is it softens the spirited part of the soul. It makes it more receptive to reason and more receptive to the kind of rational concerns that people are going to need if they're going to respond well to reason and not just do whatever they're trained to do. Another important point to get from the discussion of education is that Plato is not simply anti-pleasure. For example, in the musical education, the whole point was supposed to be that you cultivate pleasures in things like order and beauty and proportion. In that sense, part of being a good person for Plato is just being appropriately disposed with respect to good things. Namely, you enjoy doing good things and you enjoy beautiful things. Especially when we get to the Phaedrus, we'll see that beauty actually plays a really important part in inspiring people to become better. So pleasure is actually central to Plato's account of education. But he's opposed to certain kinds of bodily pleasures. So the appetitive part of the soul, which is the part of the soul which is responsible for ensuring our nourishment and continued survival, it wants to go after things which are pleasurable to the body. So the appetitive part of the soul wants to have delicious food, it wants to have pastries and cheesecake and pizza. And it also is concerned with drink and with sex. So what the point of the gymnastic education is to teach us how to resist those kinds of pleasures when they're not appropriate. When you're on a really strict diet, you know that even though it will feel good to have pizza and to have cheesecake, you shouldn't do it and things will be better overall if you don't. So again, the point is the gymnastic education trains you to resist bodily pleasures. Moreover, obviously, when you're engaging in these activities that are painful for you, when you're exercising and when you're being hit in boxing and when you're getting stabbed as part of your military training, you can't think that pain is a reason to stop doing the thing that you're doing. In that sense, gymnastic education really teaches people that pain is not an evil and pleasure isn't necessarily a good. And that's really the key point. Plato wants people to think pain is not necessarily an evil and pleasure is not necessarily a good. So it's going to make you a more well-rounded person who's able to understand why we should push through those things for some higher good. Now, fortunately, Plato gives us a really handy passage where he summarizes what he takes to be the results of both musical and gymnastic education, but also explains what happens if we focus too much on one and not enough on the other. Now, it's a long passage, but it's really important, so I do think it's worth taking the time to read through carefully. He'll work at physical exercises in order to arouse the spirited part of his nature, rather than to acquire the physical strength for which the other athletes diet and labor. That's absolutely right. Then, Glaucon, did those who established education in music and poetry and in physical training do so with the aim that people attribute to them, which is to take care of the body with the latter and the soul with the former, or with some other aim? What other aim do you mean? It looks as though they established both chiefly for the sake of the soul. Haven't you noticed the effect that lifelong physical training, unaccompanied by any training in music and poetry, has on the mind? Or the effect of the opposite, music and poetry without physical training? Savagery and toughness in the one case, and softness and overcultivation. Oh, I get the point. You mean that those who devote themselves exclusively to physical training turn out to be more savage than they should, while those who devote themselves to music and poetry turn out to be softer than is good for them. Moreover, the source of the savageness is the spirited part of one's nature. Rightly nurtured, it becomes courageous. But if it's overstrained, it's likely to become hard and harsh. So it seems. And isn't the philosophic part of one's nature that which provides the cultivation? If it is relaxed too far, it becomes softer than it should. But if properly nurtured, it is cultivated and orderly. So it is. So we say that our guardians must have both these natures. And mustn't the two be harmonized with each other? And if this harmony is achieved, the soul is both moderate and courageous. But if it is inharmonious, it is cowardly and savage. Therefore, when someone gives music an opportunity to charm his soul with the flute and to pour those sweet, soft, and plaintive tunes we mentioned through his ear, as though through a funnel, when he spends his whole life humming them and delighting in them, then, at first, whatever spirit he has is softened, just as iron is tempered. And from being hard and useless, it is made useful. But if he keeps at it unrelentingly and is beguiled by the music, after a time his spirit is melted and dissolved until it vanishes, and the very sinews of his soul are cut out and he becomes a feeble warrior. And if he had a spiritless nature from the first, this process is soon completed. But if he had a spirited nature, his spirit becomes weak and unstable, flaring up at trifles and extinguished just as easily. The result is that such people become quick-tempered, prone to anger, and filled with discontent rather than spirited. What about someone who works hard at physical training and eats well, but never touches music or philosophy? Isn't he in a good physical condition at first, full of resolution and spirit? And doesn't he become more courageous than he was before? But what happens if he does nothing else and never associates with the muse? Doesn't whatever love of learning he might have had in his soul soon become enfeebled, deaf, and blind, because he never tastes any learning or investigation or partakes of any discussion or any of the rest of music and poetry to nurture and arouse it? I believe that someone like that becomes a hater of reason and of music. He no longer makes any use of persuasion but bulls his way through every situation, by force and savagery like a wild animal, living in ignorance and stupidity without either rhythm or grace. It seems then that a God has given music and physical training to human beings not, except incidentally, for the body and the soul, but for the spirited and wisdom-loving parts of the soul itself, in order that these might be in harmony with one another, each being stretched and relaxed to the appropriate degree. Now, obviously, there's a lot to unpack in that passage, but what I really want you to see is the way in which it's important that the two parts of education are harmonized. You only get the good effects from this education when you do a balance of both music and gymnastics. Look at the ways in which Plato describes people who do too much music and not enough gymnastics. Look at how he describes people who do too much gymnastics but not enough music. It's really worth taking the time to look at that passage closely. Now, if you've been reading along with me, you will have noticed that a lot of the discussion of education focuses on musical education. The discussion of gymnastic education is short in comparison. Now, what I wanted to emphasize is that Plato really does think that these two things are equally important. But the reason he spends so much more time focusing on musical education rather than gymnastic education in the Republic is because he has a lot more to criticize about the way in which his society practiced their musical education. He thought the gymnastic education on the whole was actually pretty good. It plays an important role, but he has less to criticize, so there's less to discuss in the text. However, he's really concerned that what kids and young adults are being taught in their education regarding the music, namely the poetry that they hear and the music that they're listening to, a lot of that needs to be changed. So to finish this lecture, we'll just look really quickly at the basis for which Plato thinks that the musical curriculum needs to be updated. Now, a lot of people have objected to this insofar as they see what Plato's doing as a kind of censorship, that somehow he's wanting to stop people from getting access to a bunch of music and a bunch of literature that they otherwise would have had access to. But again, I think it's important to consider what Plato's doing in the context of the education system more generally. And one of the things that he's really concerned with is ensuring that people take pleasure in good things and take pleasure in beautiful objects. And his concern is that a lot of the images that are being taught through people like Homer and in tragedy are basically not good role models for people to have. So Plato thinks that in his own society, people are taught to admire heroes like Achilles and Odysseus, And they're taught these stories about the gods, namely where Zeus will take on different forms and go and impregnate various women and seize young men to take as his own cupbearer. And Plato thinks that this is just not the right way to think about how good people and how gods behave. So it's easiest just to see this in the context of how you would raise your own children. What kind of role models would you teach them about? What kinds of people would you teach them to admire? What kinds of people will you hold up as examples for them, and what kinds of people would you praise? And Plato basically thinks that a lot of the people who are taken to be role models in his own society aren't good role models. And so in that sense, he doesn't want them to be taught as such. He doesn't want people to admire Achilles when Achilles is getting overly emotional and is forgetting the duty that he should be having at various stages of the Iliad. Again, the easiest way to get a kind of contemporary handle on this is just to think about what kinds of television and media you would let your children watch. Would you let them watch really violent horror films? Would you let them watch Keeping Up with the Kardashians every day? If your answer to one of those questions is no, think really hard about why it is that you won't let them watch those things, especially on a daily basis. What I think most parents would say is that those shows teach bad values. Keeping Up with the Kardashians teaches people to be materialistic, to make a fuss over things that they shouldn't make a fuss about, and basically to be superficial, to care about how you appear, to care about how other people think about you. And we think that in order to raise a good person, actually you shouldn't try to instill those values. So on the one hand, you could think of what Plato's doing as a kind of political censorship. But I actually think the better way to think about it is just to think about Plato trying to be a good parent for these kids. If we're thinking about how these kids should be raised and what kinds of values we want them to have, what role models we want them to have, there's a lot of stuff we wouldn't let them watch. Of course, while Plato's focus is on early education and young children, it's not the case that later on these people are suddenly going to be exposed to bad versions of the gods, for example. But here I think Plato, and indeed a number of Greek philosophers, actually make a really important point. We tend to think that there is a point where we're a child, and then we become an adult, and once we're an adult, we should be able to have access to whatever material we want to think clearly. But Plato, and indeed Aristotle's point, is that our moral education and our moral development never really stops. If we expose ourselves to the kinds of things that we know corrupt us and make us more materialistic and make us more superficial, if we shouldn't have those things when we're 8 and we shouldn't have them when we're 12, why should we have them when we're 18 or 28 or even older? If we genuinely think that being exposed to these kinds of things makes us materialistic and makes us selfish and makes us care about things that we shouldn't care about, why should we ever watch those things in the first place? Now, obviously, there's a lot more I could say about debates about censorship and conditions under which it might be justified. But what I want you to see here is that Plato's main focus is on developing the citizen's character and making them into good people. And he thinks that a really important part of that process is that they have good and accurate role models to aspire to. So that's why it is that he wants to edit parts of Homer and edit some of these stories about the gods. He wants people to have good role models that they can aspire to. And that's the main point.